So I'm going to do some validation logic and generating custom error messages for validation. So to start, just create a Cake project. Now we're in Windows subsystem for Linux, but we're making sure that we are in the Linux side of it, not the Windows, because it's slow if you run WSL with the Windows folders. So opening up VS Code, and we start with just getting a database running, and this is the default data source, and that's all you're required if you're just going to use the SQLite database. Now the next step is we want to create a migration. So we want to create a file that will automatically generate our database tables. Now it's a very simple database table, so I'm just going to copy and paste in the code and explain it. So all we're saying is create a post table with 2 columns that are string columns, and add an index, a unique index for title, so that it makes sure that it wants it to be unique, and then just create it. So once you've got that created and your database configured, just enter Cake migrations and then the migrate command, and that will generate a default SQLite in your root directory of your project. If you want to have a look what's inside, run the command as root apt get install sqlite browser. That's from within your Windows subsystem for Linux environment, and you then can go sqlite browser. I'm not sure if you can actually pass it straight on the command line, but it will then open in Windows, but it's a Linux app, which is brilliant. And seems to have taken a while to load, but now it's loaded, and then you can see you've got you can look at your tables in SQLite without worrying too much about things there. So that's the SQLite browser if you're using the SQLite database. So once you've run your migration, you've created your tables, you also need to just generate a skeleton of views, and because we've created a post table, you'll give you an option to bake all the views on that, and you just have to enter the name, and it will have created all the models, so the database table model, and then it'll have the post controller, and in your templates it will have a number of create, update, view tables as well. So it gives you all the scaffolding there. And once that's done, you can run and view this in a web browser using inbuilt PHP server. So just get it running, and then you'll be able to connect, and if everything's right, you'll see that it's able to connect to the database. And if you type in posts in the URL, you'll see that you've got the ability to enter data. Now this missing or invalid CSRF cookie error, I believe it might be a holdover from maybe running another instance of the Cake server, but once you just press enter again and press test, you can do it. And to show you that Cake is aware of the unique constraint on the database table, notice when I've attempted to enter the same data twice, it's given me the provided value is invalid. So where is that coming from? So that error message is generated from a validationDefault method. So whenever you post information to Cake, it will by default run this default validation method, and then using the rules will described here, it will give an error message. So we can, for starters, just title must be unique. I'm going to call that just so that we know where it's coming from. So when you try that again, you can change the default text, and that's fixed, and that's okay. Now the next thing, if we comment out this rule, we can go down to our buildRules section on the posts table, and this rule is again a unique title. So if we try again to create the same post with the same title, we'll get this value is in use. So again, we can and then we'll call this one RulesChecker. So we can, again can do that. So when the validation is applied, if this is in place, so if this is in place and both of these rules are in effect, the first rule to fail will be the one that's displayed. So to disable the validation for that first level, so validationDefault, to disable that, you can go into posts controller, and we're using the add method to try and add that. So we've got this post method here. So as you can see, it creates an empty entity, and then it patches the entity with the post data from the web request. But then we can say, okay, I don't want you to validate this. So you just say validate equals false. So although the validation is set and will be called, because we've set it to validate false, when we try again, it will flip to the RulesChecker rules because the validation is not being applied. And so that's something to keep in mind if you find you're getting an odd message that doesn't make sense. It's simply, it could be just like the RulesChecker rules could be getting applied instead of the validation rules. So that's just a very quick overview of the validation that's going on. Now, so what we have here is, at the moment we're saying, okay, I don't want you to validate against these validation rules. We've turned that off, and so really this is a section of code that's being relied on. So the question would be is, if you wanted to say something a bit more crafted here, how would you go about doing it? Now one way of doing that is to go function, and when we are in a build rules section using RulesChecker rules, what is passed to each, if we put a callable in there, it's an array of options, and then it's an entity and an array of options. And so what we really want to do is we want to still use the same validation, but we're going to pass the rules in, and then we're going to make some changes to make the error message dynamic. So to do that, first thing we have, well, what did the user enter that's being said is, so grab the title, and then we can grab the, maybe we'll grab the table name. So I believe you can go table alias equals options repository, and then we go get alias, and then we need to still run this rule, but before we run it we want to modify this. So we're going to put title is already in the, we go table alias table. So that's it. Now it looks as if, right, so now we need to still run this rule and return the results. So we again can pass the options through. So we're actually going to run, let's see if we can format it a bit better. It feels as if there's something. Okay. This is probably another one of these. Nope. There we go. Okay, and closing bracket, and that should now work. Great. Okay, so what we've got there is a function that will take the entity and then we'll strip out the header, and then if we try again, let's try this, we can see that it's now given us, we might make that a quote. So we try it again. The title test is already in the post table, and so we can see that we're triggering a RulesChecker rule, and it's does exactly the same thing as the validation rule. It just stops the process and then you can fix the problem. So let's have a look at, so that's doing a custom message, and we can do the similar sort of thing within this validation here. Now this is using a default provider, which is a table class provider, which is running an SQL query in the background, and then if it fails, this validation unique validation fails, it comes back with false, and so it will then use the message. But we can also make a change here. So firstly, we'll go back to turn our validation back on, so we're getting the generic validation again, and then we go to our post table, and here we create, so we just get rid of that, type in a rule, and again we want a function. But in the validation default method and the validator that's getting passed in, it passes in the value of the form field that's being posted. And the context. So what we can then do from there is we can grab the value. So what we're going to try and do is create our own method, and because we're in a table class, we can actually use find method straight here, and we can go where, and we go get it where clause is. We want to look for a title that is the same as value, and we can look for an exact match. And if we're doing case sensitive collation in the database, that will return anything that's upper and lower case as well. But sometimes, and because I'm using SQLite, the SQLite seems to not do case insensitive matching, so putting like in here enables SQLite to match on uppercase test, lowercase test, if that was the word we're looking for. So we do this and we say, okay, I'm getting a count, and I want a boolean to say, so if the count is greater than 0, it's a duplicate. So if it's a duplicate, again, we want to return a title, and we go, this time it's value, and we want to put in quotes again, is already in use, and I'm going to say validation, so we know where that error message is coming from. Now if we do this, and we'll get title test is already in use. If we add something new, and it says the provided name is invalid, and that's because this function needs to either return false if for a failure or true for a pass. So if it's not a duplicate, we'll just return true, and then this will allow us to add the post. But again, if we try to post it again with the same value, it will warn us, and that's using validation rules there. So you can think of a lot of different ways if you have a look at what's in. So firstly you've got the value and then the context, and have a look what's being passed in. You'll see that you've got obviously the value for the field, which is the title field, and then you've got a whole heap of information including all the data that was passed, plus different validation providers that you can actually use within the validation methods there. Alright, so that is a that is a validation rule, but it's a custom validation rule. And really there's a lot of different logic you can do. Look at the documentation because it'll show you different levels of validation and how you can do them. Now at this point, let's have a look at another way of creating these rules that we've got here. Now this at the moment is a function, and when you start adding these functions they get longer and longer and longer, and so it can be beneficial to move these into their own class, and so just remove all this stuff and just have a one line. So to do that, you can, I think it's under here, creating custom rule objects. So you've got the ability to create a custom rule object. So let's do that before. So we go new folder, and we're model rule, and we're going to call this one title is unique, and we can grab the skeleton of the, actually we just need that part, and pop that in. And make sure it's labeled the right way, and pretty much we just need to then modify this to have, so if it's not going to work, so let's add public function construct, and then we'll put a, I'm going to take the rules, this rules equals rules, and don't need that. This rules, and let's see if that see if we format right. Let's see what it does. So we go back to the post table and we say new title is unique, passing the rules object. Now let's see what happens when we try and break our validation. So type in test again and test again. And so we've moved the code from the post table and into its own class, and it's working quite well. Now that's good, but notice what we're doing at the moment. We're passing in the rules object and we're using some of the built-in rules, but we can also do completely custom rules. So let's try to change this to a custom rule. Now this as part of the options, we're getting a table passed in. So we're going to grab the table, because that will allow us to use a query as our custom validation rule. So query equals table find. Let's build a query. So query, again, we want to select title, where title like, and we're looking, I've got the value for title already, and then let's do that again. We'll say is duplicate, so we get a boolean, and then we can say is duplicate, and we can then return. What can we return? Well, we might just copy the and if it's not a duplicate, we need to fail to it being okay. So now, when this rule is run, instead of running an internal rule, so we no longer need that, of course, but it doesn't matter for the purpose of demonstration. But again, it just works just the way it's supposed to. Now, what is wrong there? We've made a mistake, and we need to say count. So let's see now what we can do. Okay, and then right. So again, we try and create. So again, the validation is what's being run there. So we really need to turn off validation, sorry. And to do that, once we've done that, right. So as you can see, something's wrong. I'm pressing submit, and if I put a unique one in, it's working. But if I again try and put test, which is already duplicated, it's not allowing it to save. Now, why is that? Well, one of the things that we need to specify is, so we've got here, we've got, with this add, we've got callable, so that's going to return yes, no, or a string with the error message. But this is what we need, because we're not specifying the error field. So I'm going to type in custom is unique is my name of my rule. It could be null, and then I want to say, okay, the error field that it acts upon is title. So let's see how that looks now. Right, so now we've got the error message properly being triggered, and it's a RulesChecker error message. So we know it's the application rules being triggered, not the validation rules. And of course, all you need to do is say, well, let's just validate it off the validation rules, and again we'll get it working like that. So now that we've done a model rule title is unique rule, and using that instead of all that batch of code, and it's tidied things up. So you can imagine you'd be able to generate classes that you have your reusable code in and move them out of the model table class. So let's now look at one of the things that happens quite often, and we still want to be able to get these validation errors available. So we're going to create a command line. So if we look at bin cake, all these things listed here are commands. So all these commands are available, but we can create our own custom commands, and they appear under this app section. So let's create a command to add a post from the command line. So we might call that from cron or from some external system. So we go bin cake bake, and we want command, and we're going to call the command add post. Now when that is created, we can see there's a folder and a command is created, and then we look at the help and scroll to it, we can see now we've got add post, and to call it we simply enter add post. Obviously it's doing nothing now. So what can we do to create a usable command line application? First of all, we add an argument. We want to say, okay, I want to specify the title and it's required, and I also want to specify body and it's required. So when we do that, we'll get an error message saying that we're missing a command line option. So as soon as we added it, you'll notice that then validates the body. Now one thing that's recommended is don't write all your code in your commands, because you might want to reuse it somewhere else. So they recommend creating utility classes. So you do that by creating, like, you can call it utility, you could call it utils, and I'm going to create an AddPost utility, and this AddPost class is just going to take a title and a body, and then it's going to save it to the database. So let's look at that and how we can get this started. So maybe you'll have multiple functions within this class and they'll all reference one table. So perhaps we can do this and add a table, but it's currently not working because we need to put a LocatorAwareTrait, which will then be able to find the table. So if you have a look here, you can then put, so adding a table, might be better if I put as. Right, so what we need to do, we need to create a post entity, and we do that by just creating title, body, and because we're maybe what we're going to do, we'll do this for the time being. Right, so we've created our table entity. Then we want to attempt to save it, and if the result is a false, which it'll either be the entity if it's successfully saved or false, we want to actually tell someone about the errors. So we take the errors from the entity, and then we format them. Now the way we can do this is if we have if there's errors, so we'll just have a look at this in a minute. So what we've got here, we've created the bare bones of our create function, but let's call it. So I want to go AddPost equals new AddPost. So instantiate it, and then we want to say, okay, it's going to return a post if it works, or it's going to make it raise an exception. But what we want to do, so we want to say title equals args get argument title, and body equals args get argument body, and then it's just a matter of passing those to there. So alright, so what have we done there? So we've managed to add, if we have a look at our table, we just added that title and body there, and then we've tried to add it again, and we now get this unique validation error, which is being generated here. So it failed and we're generating error. But it's nice to get these things in a nice formatted way. So go back to our code here and we say, okay, what I'd like to do, I want to get that code in a nice looking format. And really what we want, we don't want anything other than these leaves. That's the value there. So we want to collapse everything down. So if we go hash flatten, I don't know if that's actually in imported. Okay, let's try that. So we go hash, we'll import it, and we go flatten this array. So we get this hash function. Let's run it again and just see what it creates. So now we have the entire array flattened down, and we just want to get the array values. So and if there was multiple values, we would want them in a list. So we then use another cake utility called toList, and we'll just leave it as the defaults for the time being. But here you go. Right, so now we have these values as a text string. So now we can go throw a new exception. Just want to use, and it will throw that message as a new exception. So let's look at it do that. Alright, so it's now thrown the exception and given us the error message in the exception. So this now needs to be handled well, so we can pop our code that's going to throw the exception if it fails here, and if it doesn't fail, so it doesn't bug out, we want to say to it, we'll say, okay, we want our command line to say successfully added the, and then we can say, because the post is actually available to us, we can go post title, and then there we go. And okay, and we know we've got an error there because okay, so it's throwing an exception, but nothing's coming out. So we need to say create failed, and then this time we want to get the throwable and get just the message from it and see what it does. So let's see what it does. Okay, so we're seeing now that we've got a working command line program, and it's showing us what it needs to in order to return the correct information. And at the moment we're validating using we're using the request data validation, or the array validation, but we can validate, turn off just the request validation, so and then run by the application rules validation. So we can change that by turning these on. Now another thing that we do is oftentimes, so we've turned validation off there, but we can actually use different validation. If we go back to our model, so if we go to model and we go to our post table, we can also copy our validation default here and then change this to be validation command for, so I'm submitting something via command. I've got different rules, so just then make a slight change. We can say we might want to add validation for the body as well. So we can just go back to think unique. Get rid of this. Maybe we'll just leave it as here. And we want to say title is unique. So batch is unique. Sorry, body is unique. And we want to change this to check the body field. So here we can now say, okay, instead of validating via, so within our AddPost service class, I want to say I now want to validate with a different validation method, and let's try that. So we're now using the command validation, which is, sorry, this different validation method, and it's now saying, okay, title2 is already in use and body must be unique. So you can see that you can specify different validators, and once you get that right, it works quite well. So that's a command line application of a AddPost service class, and including collapsing error messages into a list for display. I hope it's useful to someone.